Imagine sitting in a wooden box. It is pitch black outside. The wind is howling at 40 degrees below zero. You're moving at 60 miles per hour, and you know that in exactly 10 seconds you're going to crash into a wall. You just don't know if the wall will break or if you will. This was not a torture device. This was a job. For over 50 years, this was the only way railroads could keep the lines open during the brutal winters of the American West. Before the complex rotary snowplows arrived to gently chew up the ice, there was only one solution for a blocked track: brute force, pure kinetic violence. This is the story of the Wedge Plow, the suicide machine of the rails, and the men who risked their lives to turn steam locomotives into battering rams. To understand the terror of this machine, you have to understand the physics of snow. When snow falls lightly, it is soft. But when it piles up in the cuts of the Rocky Mountains or the Sierra Nevada and then melts and freezes again, it becomes something else. It becomes concrete. A drift can be 20 feet deep and hard enough to walk on. A normal train hitting that drift would crumple like a tin can. So the engineers of the 19th century designed a weapon. They took a heavy rail car and built a massive reinforced triangular prow on the front. It looked like the blade of an axe or the bow of a battleship, made of iron and thick oak timbers. It was designed to do one thing: split the snow apart and throw it off the tracks. But the Wedge Plow had no engine of its own. It had no moving parts. It was just a giant knife. To make it work, you needed speed. Enormous speed. The procedure was called bucking, and it was exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Here is how it worked. You would take the Wedge Plow and place it at the front. Behind it you would couple 2, 3, or sometimes 4 massive steam locomotives. You needed all that weight to generate momentum. The train would back up for a mile or two to get a running start. The conductors would signal the engineers. The whistles would scream. And then the throttles were thrown wide open. Imagine the sound of 4 steam engines accelerating to full power. The ground shook. The smoke turned the sky black. The goal was to hit the snowdrift as fast as possible, often at 50 or 60 miles per hour. Inside the plow itself, there was usually a small crew. A flanger operator who controlled the blades that cleaned the rails, and sometimes a lookout. They were riding in the tip of the spear. As the train approached the drift, the world disappeared. The moment of impact was violent. The plow would hit the snow with the force of a bomb going off. If everything went right, the wedge would slice into the drift. The snow would be forced up the angled blade and thrown 50 feet into the air, clearing the track in a spectacular explosion of white powder. The train would shudder, slow down rapidly, and then grind to a halt deep inside the cut. Then they would back up and do it again. But things rarely went right. The problem with bucking was that you never knew what was inside the snow. Sometimes the drift was filled with rocks that had fallen from the cliffs above. Sometimes it was a frozen tree trunk. Sometimes the ice was just too hard. If the wedge hit a rock at 50 miles per hour, the laws of physics took over. The plow wouldn't go through the snow, it would go up. There are countless stories of wedge plows climbing the rail. The force of the impact would lift the 40-ton car into the air. It would fly off the tracks, sometimes tumbling down the side of the mountain, taking the steam engines with it. There was a famous incident in the Cascade Mountains where a crew hit a drift so hard that the plow derailed, turned sideways, and was completely crushed by the locomotives pushing from behind. The men inside didn't stand a chance. Even when they didn't derail, the experience was terrifying. The windows would be smashed by flying ice. The stove inside the car would tip over, setting the wood on fire. Men would be thrown against the walls, breaking ribs and arms. And yet, for decades, this was the standard method. Why? Because it was fast. The rotary snowplow, the machine with the giant spinning wheel, was safer, yes, but it was slow. It crawled along at walking pace. In a blizzard, the snow could fill in behind the train faster than the rotary could clear it ahead. The wedge plow was lightning. It could clear 10 miles of track in the time it took a rotary to clear 1 mile. In the cutthroat business of railroading, time was money, and lives were cheap. There were different types of these rams. The most famous was the Rotary Plow. It was a refined design, with wings that could be extended to widen the cut. But the principle was always the same: hit it hard and pray you stay on the rails. The crews who manned these trains were a different breed. They were paid hazard pay. They called themselves snowbirds. They would spend weeks out in the wilderness fighting the storms. When the whistle blew for a bucking run, every man on the train braced himself. The fireman would stop shoveling coal and hold on to a strap. The engineer would grip the brake lever, ready for the emergency stop. The impact felt like a car crash. The train would decelerate from 60 to 0 in a few seconds. The shockwave would ripple through the spine of every man on board. If they punched through, there was cheering. If they got stuck, they had to dig out by hand in the freezing cold and try again. But the most dangerous moment was when the snow was deeper than the plow. If the drift was higher than the wedge, the snow would come over the top. It would smash the windows of the cab, burying the engineer and fireman in an avalanche inside their own locomotive. Many crews suffocated or were frozen to death inside their cabs when a tunnel of snow collapsed on top of them. As technology advanced, the railroads began to move away from this suicidal method. Diesel engines replaced steam. Rotaries became more powerful. Bulldozers could be brought in by road. But the wedge plow never truly disappeared. Even today, you can still see them parked on the sidings of railroads in Canada and the northern United States. They sit there, rusting monsters of steel and timber. They are kept as a last resort. When the storms are too violent, when the rotaries fail, and when the line absolutely must be opened, the railroads will still pull out the old wedge. They don't run them at 60 miles per hour anymore. They treat them with respect, but the shape is the same. It is a reminder of a time when the only way to conquer nature was to look it in the eye and charge. The era of the suicide train may be over, but the stories of the men who rode them remain. They were the shock troops of the industrial age, fighting a war against the White Death, armed only with steam and steel. So the next time you see a train moving smoothly through a snowy landscape, remember the violence that paved the way. Remember the thunder of 4 engines screaming at full throttle, and the brave souls inside the wooden box, waiting for the impact.